Some tricks saved lives. Others scared even the men they saved. In the shadows of World War II, far from medals and strategy briefings, soldiers began inventing their own ways to stay alive. Not every tactic came from a manual, and not every method was legal. When food ran out, when bullets were gone, and when orders meant death, survival became a matter of invention. And what they created was terrifying. They poisoned wells, they faked surrender, they built weapons from soap, sugar, and scraps, and some of these tricks worked so well, command banned them immediately. Not because they failed, but because they blurred the line between survival and war crime. These weren't rumors, these were real methods used in silence, hidden from reports, passed in whispers between men who had nothing left to lose. Some were erased from records, others were quietly copied behind closed doors for future wars. In this video, you'll uncover 8 World War II soldier survival tricks so risky, so brutally effective, they were banned the moment they were discovered. Hit like and subscribe to uncover the skills that history tried to bury. Number 1, Ghost Army deception tactics. In 1944, the US military deployed a unit that broke every rule of traditional warfare. It marched without soldiers. It rolled without engines, and yet it fooled entire Nazi divisions into retreating from battles that never existed. They called it the Ghost Army. This wasn't a combat unit. It was a deception force made up of artists, sound engineers, radio specialists, and set designers, men trained not to fire weapons, but to craft illusions. Their mission: confuse, distract, and manipulate enemy intelligence long enough for real units to strike elsewhere. Their tools were surreal. Inflatable rubber tanks, fake howitzers, painted vehicles made of canvas and air, loudspeakers hidden in trees, played looping recordings of troops marching, engines revving, and shouted orders designed to echo across empty fields for miles. Even their uniforms lied. Soldiers changed insignias daily, posed as officers, and staged fake patrols near towns they had no intention of occupying. Radios were manned with carefully scripted false transmissions mimicking the chatter of entire divisions. It wasn't just theater. It was psychological warfare. And it worked better than anyone expected. In one operation near the Rhine River, the Ghost Army tricked German scouts into believing a massive Allied force was preparing to cross at a false location. The real troops crossed elsewhere with almost no resistance. It saved lives without firing a shot. But it came with risk. If caught, these men had no protection, no backup, no real weapons, only rubber, wire, and voices in the trees. Their success was so disturbing, so complete, that the mission was classified for decades, not because it failed, but because it had worked too well. In the end, the Ghost Army proved a haunting truth. You don't need bullets to win a war. You need belief strong enough to move armies. One forgotten tactic. One more day alive. Number 2, bat bombs. It started with a simple idea. If bombs fall straight down, what if we needed something that flies sideways? In 1942, a dentist named Lytle Adams proposed a bizarre concept to the US government. Use bats, real, living bats, to deliver firebombs across Japanese cities. It sounded like madness, but to military planners looking for any edge, it sounded just crazy enough to try. And so began one of the strangest projects of World War II, Project X-ray. The method was horrifying in its brilliance. Tiny incendiary explosives were strapped to bats, the Mexican free-tailed species, known for roosting in dark, dry places like attics and temples. The bats were placed into bomb-shaped canisters, cooled into hibernation, and dropped from aircraft at dawn. As they warmed midair, they'd wake, scatter, and instinctively seek shelter inside enemy buildings. Minutes later, the delayed charges would ignite. The plan wasn't to kill soldiers, it was to burn cities. Wooden homes, paper walls, bamboo roofs. The architecture of 1940s Japan was perfect for fire spread. One bat in the right attic could turn an entire block into ash. And during testing in New Mexico, it worked too well. One group of bats escaped early and set the entire test base on fire. That's when the military realized they'd created a weapon they couldn't fully control. Project X-ray was shut down before ever being deployed, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too unpredictably. To this day, bat bombs remain one of the most surreal survival tricks ever invented by the military. Nature weaponized, morality blurred, and fire carried by creatures of the night. What makes it chilling isn't just the design. It's the mindset behind it. If it flies, it can be turned into a weapon. This wasn't just experimentation. It was desperation in disguise. Now, here's the question for you. If you were in charge, would you have used it? Drop your answer in the comments. Let's see who thinks like a tactician and who thinks like a survivor. Number 3, fake surrender signals. There are rules in war, but when survival hangs by a thread, even rules can become a liability. During World War II, surrender was supposed to be sacred. A raised hand, a white cloth, a wounded soldier stepping forward. It was a language understood by all sides, a plea for mercy, a sign to stop the fighting. But in the chaos of collapsing lines, that language was sometimes rewritten and used against those who trusted it. In isolated fronts, scattered across Europe, stories began to emerge, units signaling surrender only to act unexpectedly once the enemy drew close. What began as isolated rumors grew into widespread unease. A soldier appearing injured but signaling others. A white cloth shown from a building just before fire erupted. Moments that blurred the line between tactic and trust. The result wasn't just confusion. It was hesitation. Troops who once offered aid began second-guessing. Commanders who accepted surrender with open hands became cautious. Even medical teams trained to help first, ask later, began to wait, unsure what was real. It wasn't about numbers, it was about what it broke, the fragile code that kept war from becoming chaos. Military leadership responded quickly. Across several fronts, official orders were issued. Deceptive use of surrender signals would result in severe disciplinary action, not because it didn't work, but because it risked unraveling the very principle of mutual humanity during conflict. But even with strict rules, trust once lost is hard to rebuild. Some called these moments clever, others called them cautionary. But everyone agreed they changed the way soldiers read the battlefield forever. This wasn't just about tactics. It was about how survival can reshape the meaning of a symbol. Because once a signal of peace becomes a tactic of strategy, the battlefield never sees it the same again. This isn't about judgment. It's about what war forces people to become. One blurred line, one irreversible choice. Would you have taken the risk or walked away? Tell us in the comments. Number 4, weaponized clothing traps in World War II. Even clothing became a weapon. Not metaphorically, literally. As front lines blurred and uniforms began changing hands, stolen, stripped, or scavenged, some soldiers found a brutal solution to protect what little they had. They trapped their own clothing. Boots, belts, jackets, even gloves wired with crude mechanisms, tiny triggers, or pressure-sensitive surprises, designed not to be worn, but to punish anyone who dared to take them. In the colder zones of the Eastern Front, reports surfaced of discarded coats rigged with grenades. Pick one up, and a pin would slip free. A boot left on a path tempting to any under-equipped patrol was hollowed out and packed with a timed charge. These weren't common, but they were effective enough that entire units were warned not to touch enemy uniforms, no matter how desperate the need. Sometimes it wasn't about explosives. It was psychological. A belt dyed with toxin. A glove laced with irritant powder. Traps designed not to kill, but to make soldiers fear every abandoned item they saw. In ruined cities and remote forests, where survival depended on scavenging, this tactic worked quietly, not just by injury, but by creating hesitation, paranoia, delay, distrust. What made it chilling wasn't just the method, it was the context. Soldiers weren't trapping clothing out of cruelty. They were doing it because everything else was gone. No bullets, no backup, no margin for loss. If someone stole their only coat, they could freeze. If someone took their boots, they might never walk again. So they left a warning, not in words, but in design. Eventually, command units on both sides discouraged the practice not just because of danger, but because of unintended consequences. Medics, civilians, even allies sometimes paid the price. Still, the idea never fully disappeared, because in total war, when the line between tool and trap vanishes, even what you wear can decide who walks away. This wasn't just survival, it was memory, passed down in silence. Number 5, rat sabotage. It wasn't the size of the weapon that mattered, it was where it hid. In the covert world of World War II sabotage, few tricks were as strange or as quietly clever as the one devised by British Special Operations, using dead rats as a delivery system. The goal? Sabotage enemy infrastructure. Not by force, but by distraction, fear, and psychological disruption. The method was called rat sabotage. British agents took real rodent carcasses and filled them with small charges. But here's the twist. They weren't meant to detonate often. In fact, they were never supposed to be triggered at all. Instead, they were planted near industrial boilers, furnaces, and factory incinerators across enemy territory. Why? Because soldiers routinely burned waste. And if a worker tossed one of these into a fire, the risk was there, and that risk was the weapon. Word of the discovery spread fast among Axis engineers. Suddenly, every piece of waste had to be inspected. Maintenance slowed. Crews became cautious. Time was wasted. Fear did the job better than any explosion could. It was warfare by suggestion. The rat became a symbol not of damage, but of doubt. And in war, doubt is powerful. The operation didn't last long. A shipment of these special rats was intercepted early, and the secret was out. But the tactic had already worked, not by physical destruction, but by altering the enemy's behavior. That's what made it so effective, and so quietly dangerous. The plan was eventually abandoned. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded in ways that were unpredictable, hard to control, and impossible to replicate at scale. But even decades later, it's still studied as one of the most innovative examples of psychological disruption in warfare. It proved something haunting. You don't need to destroy the machine if you can scare the man who operates it. This was survival through subtlety, and victory by misdirection. Would you have ever guessed a rodent could cause that much fear? Number 6, poisoned wells and salted fields. When retreat was the only option, leaving anything behind was a risk. In the brutal landscapes of Eastern Europe, where towns changed hands overnight and supply lines vanished in snow, soldiers faced a grim choice: walk away or deny the enemy everything. That's when a harsh tactic reemerged, one rooted in ancient history, but revived with terrifying efficiency: scorched earth. Soviet and German forces both used it. So did partisans and retreating resistance fighters. When abandoning a village, a post, or even an entire province, they didn't just leave. They erased what was useful. Wells were made undrinkable, sometimes filled with debris, mud, or other materials that took weeks to clear. Farmlands were lined with salt, making them infertile for entire seasons. Stored grain was spoiled. Barns were emptied or quietly dismantled. This wasn't about harming civilians. It was about outlasting the enemy. If they couldn't feed their horses, if they couldn't drink the water, they couldn't advance. It was strategy by subtraction, warfare through denial. The real power of this tactic wasn't in what it destroyed, it was in what it delayed. German divisions pushing through Russian front lines often found entire regions stripped clean. What was once a farm became a wasteland. What looked like a village on a map was now a shell with nothing inside. Soldiers who thought they were gaining ground were really walking into absence. And absence slows everything: morale, movement, momentum. But it wasn't just soldiers who used this. In France, some resistance groups reportedly tainted wine supplies and spoiled stored food before evacuating. In Yugoslavia, entire storage cellars were emptied into rivers to prevent enemy use. Over time, commanding officers began to discourage widespread scorched earth actions, not because they didn't work, but because recovery became impossible for locals. What helped one army survive a week left civilians struggling for years. Still, the tactic endures in military history for one reason. It's the strategy of the cornered, the tactic of the outnumbered. Because when you know you can't win on the ground, you make sure no one else can either. Would you have done the same or left it standing? Tell us in the comments. Number 7, condom water carriers. It wasn't designed to carry water, but when nothing else worked, it became one of the most discreet, reliable tools a soldier could carry. In the harsh terrain of North Africa, the swamps of the Pacific, and the bombed-out valleys of Europe, World War II soldiers often found themselves cut off from supply lines. Canteens ran dry. Wells were distant or already emptied. And in some cases, stopping to look for water meant exposing your position. So soldiers turned to something they never expected to rely on. Field-issued rubber sheaths, originally included in survival kits for personal health. Why? Because they were incredibly compact, flexible, and most importantly, waterproof. When stretched and filled carefully, these thin rubber containers could hold nearly a liter of water. Tied at the top, wrapped in cloth for protection, and stored in a helmet or pocket, they became emergency hydration tools in the most unlikely places. It wasn't their intended use. But in a survival scenario, utility always beats tradition. Soldiers in the British SAS, US, paratrooper units, and even downed pilots in the Pacific Theater were trained to use every item in their gear for multiple purposes. What mattered wasn't what something was made for, but what it could do. In one field manual, special instructions even described how to rinse thoroughly, fill slowly to avoid tearing, wrap in fabric to reduce movement noise, tie tightly with wire or string to avoid spillage. The result? A virtually weightless, easily concealed water carrier that could be deployed in moments. Some soldiers took it further, using them to transport fuel, hide sensitive papers, or even float small supplies across streams. They were never meant to be part of tactical operations, but that's exactly what made them perfect. No one suspected them. After the war, these unconventional uses were quietly removed from official training, not because they were ineffective, but because they blurred the line between necessity and improvisation. And improvisation often doesn't fit inside military doctrine, but for those who used them in the field, the memory stuck. Because when you're alone, dehydrated, and miles from help, anything that holds water becomes priceless. It's a quiet reminder that real survival doesn't come from the tool itself, it comes from the creativity behind it. Have you ever used something for a survival purpose it wasn't meant for? Share it in the comments. Your trick might just help someone else. Number 8, fire in a bottle. In the chaos of the Second World War, when soldiers were cut off from supplies and resistance fighters were left with nothing but kitchens and barns, they began to experiment with materials no one considered dangerous until they were. Across Europe, small groups discovered that fire could be shaped, controlled, even weaponized, and they did it not with advanced chemistry, but with ordinary household items. Fuel from farm machines or cooking oil, soap scraped from ration bars, sugar, grease, even powdered rubber or paint. Mixed carefully, these everyday ingredients created a thick, sticky substance that clung to surfaces and burned hotter than an open flame. What began as field improvisation soon became a whispered method, shared quietly between units and resistance cells. In cities like Warsaw and Budapest, this mixture was placed inside glass jars, sealed tightly, and topped with fabric wicks. It wasn't meant to explode. It was meant to ignite and hold. Once thrown, the liquid stuck to walls, vehicles, even clothing, and burned longer than raw fuel alone. Some fighters used it to disable enemy transport, others used it to clear pathways or trigger distractions. But the formula itself was volatile. One wrong step, and it ignited during preparation. Inexperienced fighters were harmed not in battle, but in back rooms, and cellars where the mix went wrong. Commanders quickly saw the risk. Manuals that once mentioned it quietly removed the recipes. Training materials deleted the references. Soldiers were told, don't try it, don't replicate it, and don't carry it unless specifically ordered. But it was too late to erase, because once something works in the field, it spreads. It wasn't the substance that made it dangerous, it was how simple it was. No special lab, no rare parts, just knowledge and intent. And for those who were desperate, sometimes that was all they had. Today, these techniques are rarely spoken of. You won't find them in standard history books. But the idea behind them still matters. When everything is stripped away, survival isn't about what you have, it's about what you can make from what's left behind. In the end, fire doesn't care where it came from. It only cares what it touches. What's your take? Would you trust a method so powerful that even armies stop teaching it? Let us know in the comments. Now you know the truth. Not the kind taught in textbooks, not the strategies discussed in classrooms, but the raw, hidden methods that came from the mud, the fear, and the silence of war. These weren't tactics designed for glory. They were born in desperation, refined under pressure, and buried by those who knew they could never be spoken of again. Because they didn't just bend the rules. Some erased them entirely. Soldiers didn't improvise because they wanted to. They did it because they were out of time, out of tools, and surrounded by decisions no man should have to make. They turned rats into warnings, water into traps, uniforms into protection. And sometimes, even peace itself became part of the deception. Each trick you've seen tonight wasn't just about staying alive. It was about refusing to vanish, refusing to become nameless, refusing to give the enemy everything, including the narrative. But after the dust settled, many of these tactics were banned, buried, forgotten, not because they failed, but because they worked. Too well, too unpredictably, too dangerously. And that's exactly why they matter now. Because in a world growing more fragile by the day, where power can vanish overnight and safety can disappear in minutes, it's the old knowledge, the uncomfortable lessons, and the quiet resilience of history that will keep us standing. If this video showed you even one method you'd never heard before, if you felt the weight of what these soldiers carried, not just in their packs, but in their minds, then don't let it end here. Subscribe. Share. Keep this knowledge alive. Because one day, someone you care about might need it, and they won't find it in an app. They'll find it in you.